Hi everyone, and welcome to the COVID-19 Remote Learning Resource webinar, the focus on setting up in Google Classroom. So this webinar was originally offered on May 1st. We were unable to make a recording of it at that time, so now I am making a recording and walking through this webinar, and that will be available on our website on remote.newvisions.org. So welcome. My name is Libby. I am part of the New Visions team, and I develop resources for biology, living environment, and COVID-19. So welcome. This webinar is part of a 3-session series. This one was originally aired on May 1st with a focus on Google Classroom. The second webinar that was offered was with a focus on formative assessment and feedback. And in the future, from today anyway, there will be one offered on May 22nd, which is also using the same resource, but the focus will be on peer-to-peer discussion. So today's agenda, we are going to spend some time looking through the COVID-19 Learning Plan number 3, which is titled, Where Did COVID-19 Come From? We are going to model together how to launch a remote learning lesson. Learn about how to set up a module in Google Classroom, and some tips on using Google Classroom and thinking about whether to use synchronous or asynchronous portions of the module. So the goals for this webinar is to introduce the learning module, to demonstrate some remote learning best practices that we've learned through working with teachers using these modules, first of all, how to do a synchronous launch of a learning module, and how to use Google Classroom for assignments. We'll also talk briefly about how teachers can become aware of additional ways that we can support you, including future webinars, updates to the learning site, and how to contact us if you have some questions or need some one-on-one support. So the one thing that we want to always keep in the forefront as we're designing materials and supporting teachers at this time is that the Regents exams are canceled and that we're dealing with a really challenging time for both teachers and students. And there's a wide variation out there of students and their access to technology, to teachers' access to technology. And so just keeping all of these challenges in the forefront as we design these materials and support teachers. We do want to make sure that we provide time and space for students to make sense of things that matter. I think that's why these COVID-19 resources are so important, because this is something in the forefront right now in everyone's mind. We do need to be cognizant of how we think about assessment and providing evidence for students of their progress and of their learning and their evidence of their mastery, because again, the Regents exams are not being used to make that determination. We have to make sure we have evidence. So that's in the forefront of our minds as we use these resources. And as I mentioned earlier, just really thinking about flexibility, that some students work best in asynchronous environments, some students work better in synchronous environments, or perhaps a blend of both. And we try to design our materials to be able to support all of those students and their needs. So just a quick review of these terms around synchronous. We'll use a lot. That means online in real time. Asynchronous instruction, which is providing students resources and some tasks and allowing them to do those tasks in their own time, at their own place, and in their own pace. And blended instruction, which is a combined approach. So the first thing we're going to do is just do a flyover of this resource, which is available, as I mentioned earlier, at remote.newvisions.org under curricular resources. All of the science learning modules follow a similar instructional model. So we always start the modules out sorry, let me just back up there. They all follow a similar instructional model, and this module and all the modules have a very similar sequence of events. They start out with a launch, which provides students with a phenomenon that they can relate to and ask questions about and think about. Then some work time, where students get to individually try to make sense of a phenomenon using different resources, perhaps animations or videos or texts. Then there's an opportunity for a check-in with teachers and also perhaps peer-to-peer check-ins, and then a wrap-up with a culminating activity or task that provides students an opportunity to show their learning and their growth around this content, around a specific content. So in this case, we start out with a launch where students are presented with a visual from around the 1980s when HIV and AIDS was first emerging in the news and it was a new virus. Students have a little text that just provides a little bit more information about this time period, and students answer some questions and start thinking about how something like HIV might be similar and different to where we are right now with COVID-19. During the work time, students have two core tasks. One is an investigation where they analyze graphs and maps and visuals to surface ideas and trends and components of zoonosis, of how we have this phenomenon of viruses jumping from animals to people. Then they have a series of readings, texts, and videos that they use an organizer or a note catcher to organize their thoughts as they dig into the science around viral mutations, about how human and animals are interacting more, and how this is allowing these opportunities for these viruses to jump hosts. A check-in with some discussion boards and opportunities for there to be peer or teacher feedback using a checklist, an assessment checklist. And a wrap-up where students take all of their learning from this module and respond to the original question around where did COVID-19 come from. And so this is set up in Google Slides. So students basically right now they're out of order. So the first task students have is they need to move the slides around to put it in a correct order or sequence of events. And there are spaces in the slides for students to elaborate on different events within this sequence, some of which students have a choice on and some of which we require, because those are the slides that really dig into the science content that this module is aligned to around natural selection, mutation, and the mutation of viruses. So that's what the overview of the plan looks like. The next thing I'm going to do is just talk through what would this be like if you launched this activity synchronously with your students. What would this look like? What would this feel like? And the way we would do that is just to present this visual. And so students would be in a Zoom, be in a Hangout with you, etc., whichever platform you're using to have a synchronous event. And students would all click on that and look at this visual together. And as I mentioned, this is a historical image from a newspaper in the 1980s, which is one of the first newspaper articles or early newspaper articles around when HIV and AIDS became a concern in the United States. And I think it's very similar in that people were afraid. We didn't have a lot of information. We weren't sure who it was targeting. So students, they might think of HIV as having always been around because of their lifetimes, it's always been around. But I think we know that, this started to become an issue in the 1980s. And so they get some more context here. There's a little bit of a text that talks about, at first it kind of emerged in the United States in the 1980s as far as we knew. But researchers were able to track down the first person that died of AIDS, which was the 1950s, at least that they found so far. But they do have some evidence that HIV might have been affecting people since the 1920s. But at some point, it was still a novel virus, just like COVID-19 is. It jumped right from an animal to human. And at this point, students would maybe have some ideas around why that happened or where it came from, or some parallels to COVID-19. They would read this text, and then you would provide them with three different question choices, three different questions they are able to respond to. First of all, what do you know about HIV/AIDS? Which might be a great question for some students that aren't ready to maybe think about other connections. Some other students might be able to address a question like, well, why do you think we never heard about this before 1981 in the United States? Or even, why do you think people were not infected before the 1920s? So you offer these questions as choices, or you assign them to students depending on the needs and the context of your classroom. And you ask students to answer in the chat to everyone. And you provide students some time, answer those questions. You get to see what their answers are. You can also ask students then to respond to each other, to choose one partner and respond. Basically have a synchronous discussion through chat that then you would choose certain students to perhaps elaborate on their responses to surface certain ideas. And so that's what that would look like in a synchronous format. Or we can use Google Classroom to launch this completely asynchronously, with students working on this exact same task at their own time and in their own pace. So let's log into Google Classroom. Well, actually, hold on. Let me show you the next slide first before I show you the Google Classroom. So we have a Google Classroom set up that you're welcome to dig around in and look at for this module. It's an example Google Classroom for this module. And so I know that there's a wide range of abilities and places where we're all at in terms of technology. And so if you are very comfortable with Google Classroom and you know how to access it and you know how to set it up, you can just fast forward through this portion. But in case you are still new to Google Classroom, I'm just going to offer a few ideas on how to, or a few directions on how to get into Google Classroom. So the first thing is to think about is the Gmail. So because of security reasons, you cannot log into classrooms that are outside of your Gmail domain. So if you're using a Google Apps for Education email address, which many of you would probably have for your school, you would not be able to log into this Google Classroom. Only you and your students and other people in your school or within your domain can have classrooms with each other and be inside of each other's classrooms. This Google Classroom is set up with a personal Gmail account. So then you would also need to use a personal Gmail account that's not associated with any type of domain to be able to log into it. So number one, yeah, make sure you're logged into a personal Gmail if you feel comfortable with that to be able to access this Google Classroom. Second step is to click on the little waffle right there by my smiling face, and then choose Google Classroom from the drop-down list. And then this is a part that I got tripped up on the first time I tried to use Google Classroom, is you have to click on the plus sign and then join a class. Or if you're ready to create your own class, you would click on the create the class. And then it's going to ask you for input code. And the code for this classroom is shown on the screen there. So you're welcome at any time now or in the future to enter into that classroom and like dig around and see how that's set up. So again, that's the code. And in just a second, I'm going to go into that Google Classroom and we're going to look at those launch activities that could be done asynchronously. So this Google Classroom, basically there's two tips that I would offer as you're setting up a Google Classroom. The first thing is to make sure that you title the Google Classroom use a very specific title because students are bombarded with different Google Classrooms that they're being invited into and are having a hard time identifying a class the class that they're supposed to join. And so just being very, very specific, living environment, period 3, etc., like a very clear title for the Google Classroom. The second thing is within the Google Classroom, setting up a unit or a module by using topics that are also clearly titled. And so for this case, we have 4 components to this module. We have a launch, we have individual work time, we have the check-in, and we have the wrap-up and final task. And another thing to note as you go through this Google Classroom in your own time is to look at the due dates for assignments. This is really meant for this module to be anywhere between 1 week and 3 weeks of instruction. And so the dates are spread out so that students have time to be able to complete. If you choose to do everything asynchronously, the students have time to be able to complete all the assignments and get feedback from you and revise their work. So if we were looking just at the launch, right, we would be under the topic of module launch. And students would first click on the material here, and it's the same visual that we looked at when modeling a synchronous instruction. So it's the same visual, the same text that students would on their own time look through. And this should pop up in just a second. There we go. Same thing. But in this case, instead of answering those prompts synchronously in a chat window, students would go to the question, they would view the question, and the questions are available to them here. They're able to respond, and it creates a very simple discussion board where students can respond. You can respond to them, they can respond back to you. Students, if you allow them to in the settings when you set up the question, students can also respond to each other, and you're able to view all of those responses and all the discussion between students. And again, this is all happening on their own time in an asynchronous format. So how do we decide if we would like to do a launch, for example, synchronously or asynchronously? There's definitely some pros and cons that we can think through from using both strategies. So some positive sides to using a synchronous launch is that students have some face-to-face interactions, right? And as a teacher, you're looking at their comments in real time, and you can clear up confusion easily and quickly, whether it's confusion about the content or even just where is the question that you're talking about, what's the visual I'm supposed to use. You know, it allows teachers to clear all those things up very quickly and focuses students. It also gets kids excited sometimes to be able to talk about something in real time with their teacher or with other students. And so you get that momentum going and this excitement in the questions, the juices flowing. But at the same time, a synchronous launch or a synchronous activity of any kind does put some students at a disadvantage. Right? Some students need more processing time. Some students are still having trouble with Wi-Fi, having trouble with devices. Some students need more time typing than others. And so those same students that sometimes you might need to provide extra support in the classroom because they need a little bit of extra support or a little bit more processing time, it's going to put those kids at a disadvantage in some cases. The only suggestion I have really for that is about wait time. And that's something that I struggle with in doing webinars and as well, and doing synchronous work, is that it just takes a little bit more time, and it's uncomfortable pause and uncomfortable quiet sometimes, but just training ourselves to just give everyone a little bit more time to respond, to bring in some of those students. Asynchronous also can have some pros and cons to them. You might get, because students have more time, you might be able to get more substantial work from students. Again, they have more time to process. They can look back through the documents that they're supposed to look at. They might do a Google search of something. They might ask a parent, like, hey, I didn't realize that HIV wasn't around forever. Like you might be able to get some more interesting ideas from students in an asynchronous format. And it definitely addresses all of those cons around those kids that need extra time. Cons for synchronous, allowing for more extra time. So it's the problem with asynchronous is that there's almost no way to really support students quickly, right? That it's, if they're confused, it's just a tricky way to be able to catch those kids and bring them back in. So I would invite you to walk through the entire modules in Google Classroom. And these are some prompts that you can use for yourself to think through how to set up a Google Classroom using this module. So think through how many activities are there. What do you notice about due dates? That's something I mentioned earlier. What are the feedback opportunities? So where is it in this module where you think, wow, this is something that's really important. I want to make sure I hear what students are thinking about this and be able to respond to it. We can't respond to everything, right? You can't provide feedback on everything. So thinking strategically around where is it that we want to do? We want to put our time into feedback. In what ways are there a low floor, high ceiling? Again, thinking about all students and access for all students. and diversity of learners. So just as a final thought, I hope that this webinar was useful for you. If you have any questions, you're welcome to reach out to anyone on the New Vision Science team for some more support in creating a Google Classroom or in using this module. We do offer one-on-one office hours. We have a calendar of support where we offer webinars, synchronous webinars that you can join. The remote learning website has new resources. We have new modules that come up every 3 weeks for chemistry, for living environment, for COVID-19, and maybe in the future, some physics modules. And stay tuned. I will see you soon in the next live webinar. And our last thought here is I just want to offer this opportunity that New Visions is hiring. And so if you are interested in moving schools or have friends or family members that are looking for a position in a school, please reach out to New Visions, and thank you for joining us. All right, bye-bye.